recognition.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will distribute the amendment to all members.
Okay, that's okay.
Oh, they're ready.
This is going to take a minute. Yeah. I'm not ready.
That's okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Well, yes, you weren't here yet.
reserve
Ready.
point of order, sir.
Point of
Okay.
order is reserved by Mr. Higgins. We're distributing the amendment.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
The second amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 8706 is offered by Ms. Pressley of Massachusetts.
The amendment is considered read. I now recognize Ms. Pressley.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment seeks to ensure that this legislation does not erase or ignore the undeniable history of systemic racism in our country. It adds a section to the top of the bill that is a straightforward acknowledgement that, quote, the federal government has implemented policies that perpetuate systemic racism, end quote. Systemic racism refers to a network of public policies, institutional practices, cultural norms, and social structures that work together to maintain racial inequities. This is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of fact that originates in the founding of this nation and has implications to this very day. Our government has been deeply intertwined with this system, from enshrining slavery and the 3/5 compromise into the United States Constitution to implementing redlining, segregation, and other discriminatory policies based on race. Now, I know that talking about the existence of racism in America makes some uncomfortable, but remember, this is a bill that you all brought up. So to my colleagues, let me just say that acknowledging these truths is not an act of blame. It is an act of responsibility. We must take responsibility. If you are serious about ending reverse racism, you need to acknowledge that it exists in the first place, and that means voting in favor of this amendment.
Gentlelady yields back. I'll recognize myself. Oppose the amendment, which adds a rule of construction to the bill's amendments to the Civil Rights Act to state that nothing in the bill should be interpreted as denying that the federal government has implemented policies that perpetuate systematic racism. Nothing in the bill speaks to the issue. Therefore, no rule of construction is necessary. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Any other members seek recognition? Seeing none. The question is on the amendment number 2, offered by Ms. Pressley. All those in favor?
Yeah.
All those?
I'm sorry, can I be recognized?
Are you seeking recognition to
Yes,
speak?
yes, Mr. Chairman.
I thought we'd already recognized you to speak. I guess somebody, can you yield Ms. Presley time?
May
Mr.
I?
Mfume?
Chairman, yeah, I would yield time to the gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Mfume yields his time to Ms. Presley.
Thank you. Ignoring systemic racism will not make it go away. By supporting this amendment, Congress can acknowledge a truth and set us on a path to fairness, justice, and progress for all. If Republicans are genuinely interested in denying racism exists against Black people, Indigenous people, and all people of color, it is a reflection of your values and explains the policies they put forth, including this bill. Now, we acknowledge that progress has been made. The progress is real and worth celebrating, but that doesn't mean that our work is done. Recognizing injustices and their impacts is essential to building on that progress and ensuring that it lasts. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Any further discussion? Seeing none? Yes.
I just want a point of clarification here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are addressing, this bill is being proposed to address reverse racism, yet we're not willing to acknowledge racism.
Would just a point? What are you doing here?
I'm asking for
But stating-
clarification. If the bill that, the amendment that Ms. Pressley is proposing suggests that we just simply acknowledge that racism exists, and the fundamental point of your legislation is to deal with reverse racism, then I should ask you, what are we doing here?
I would assume you were asking Ms. Pressley the question.
No, I'm asking you.
Did you might as well ask Ms. Pressley the question?
Well, maybe I should ask the author of this legislation. Mr. Cloud?
Yes, ma'am. I apologize. I was reading.
Okay. Just trying to get clarity here. If we cannot agree that racism exists, but this legislation you're proposing is to deal with reverse racism, why are we here?
I think you answered the question in your question.
I don't think I did. Reverse racism is included in the language, yet you
Racism
do
is
not want
racism.
to acknowledge that racism exists, which is simply Ms. Presley's request here.
We have discussed that over and over. There's been no denouncement or statement that racism doesn't exist. We've talked about the fact that it indeed does, and it's a horrible condition of the human heart of some people that still does exist.
So you are in support of Ms.
This-
Presley's amendment, then? It sounds like you are.
This rule of construction that's, by the way, being given to us at the last minute, one, us coming through figuring out what the intended consequences are, as these were not submitted in advance, as my bill was, is one of the challenges. There's no legal definition of what systemic racism is. I think we would want to talk about what government, what policies, and all those sort of things. So this is a pretty broad statement that I'm not sure I could support in the time I have to look at this.
I will yield to Ms. Presley.
Thank you to the gentlelady from Ohio. This bill is all about racism, which is exactly why my amendment is relevant. And the congressional record needs a clear vote on my amendment so that the American people will know where members of this committee stand on this issue. For all people who know racism exists and want to end it, I urge you to vote yes. I yield back.
All right. Any other members seek recognition? Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Chairman, setting aside the rule of construction in the interest for transparent and candid response to my colleague's query, the amendment is poorly written. It uses past tense and current tense on the same subject matter without indicating a shift in time. You're not just saying in a statement that we acknowledge that racism is a part of human nature and exists as part of the human construct. Of course, the corruption is born of the heart of man, not the mechanisms of man. Every one of us would recognize that racism exists throughout human history, in every culture, in every land. The sun never sets, nor has it, on some manifestation of racism throughout the history of man. Yes, there you go. Statement in the Oversight Committee, part of the historical record now. But your amendment, the good lady has introduced an amendment which I oppose because it's very poorly written and it's quite condemning of the American people and American society. What her amendment is saying is that prior acts of our nation and our forefathers before us have perpetuated systemic racism that currently exists in our country. You're asking us to say that America is systemically racist. And that's not the same as saying that just admit that racism exists, which is what you're stating when you discuss this. But in writ, it's quite different. So I oppose the amendment. Appreciate the effort, but no.
Any other members seek recognition? Ms. Trask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a fascinating colloquy now, and I wanted to just suggest one thought for Mr. Higgins. I actually think this is a very well-written amendment. It says, nothing in this act shall be construed to deny that the federal government has implemented policies that perpetuate systemic racism. And I'll give you one good example, Mr. Higgins. I think
it doesn't say has implemented policies that have perpetuated systemic racism, nor does it say has implemented policies that have perpetuated racism. It identifies systemic racism.
Can I give you,
and past tense versus current.
I'm happy to have inaudibly yielded to you on that point, but let me just reclaim my time for 1 sec, because I want to suggest a really excellent book for people who are interested in just this question of how the federal government itself has implemented policies that indeed perpetuate, in the present tense, systemic racism. The book is called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. And it's about federal housing policy and the FHA and veterans policy, all of which deliberately segregated America and deliberately gave certain kinds of benefits to whites that were not available to blacks, and then deliberately and consciously redlined areas. I read it, I think, about, 6 or 7 years ago, so forgive me for not being able to detail more precisely what it's talking about. But the author, Richard Rothstein, explains how federal housing policies in the 1940s and 50s explicitly mandated segregation and destroyed the capacity of African-American families to be in integrated neighborhoods and of white families to be in integrated neighborhoods. That was a deliberate policy. So, I mean, it would be nice to believe that when the 13th Amendment was adopted and slavery was abolished and the 14th Amendment was passed, that everything was okay. There was an effort in the Reconstruction, and again with the radical Republicans' efforts to transfer resources to the recently freed population to lift people up who had been downtrodden by law for centuries, but then Reconstruction was undone. And we got into Jim Crow and poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the whole system of inequality in the law, which lasted at least up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but it didn't end there either. And so there's a real history to it, and I think that's what makes all of these issues so difficult. And I know that there is a theory which is, well, let's not focus on it, let's wave a magic wand and say everything's okay, as opposed to continuing to engage in inclusive and open efforts to redress the injuries of the past and to move forward. And look, I agree with people who think that, bureaucracies are awkward. All bureaucracies are awkward. There's no doubt about that. Everybody finds bureaucracy awkward, but what the process we've been going through as a country is far better than what we've seen in other places in the world, like racial stratification and violence and tribal violence and apartheid and all of those things. So this is what we get in the greatest multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic constitutional democracy, efforts to be conscious of the past and to move forward. So I like Ms. Pressley's amendment. I think it's actually very well worded, and I definitely plan to vote for it, and I'm happy to yield.
Will the
And I will yield to the author of the amendment.
To my colleagues, let me just reiterate again that acknowledging these truths is not an act of blame. This is not a blame amendment. It's just simply an act of responsibility. So let's take the responsibility.
Any other members seek recognition? Seeing none.
Sorry, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman.
Have you already been recognized, Ms. Stansbury, on this amendment?
Not on this
Okay.
amendment, no, Mr.
I
Chairman.
recognize Ms. Stansbury for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but I do have to say that I could not have imagined that I would be debating the existence of racism this morning. I did not have that on my bingo card. But I just want to point out the irony of the debate that we're having right now, because there's been some discussion again this morning about free speech. And when you read the actual underlying bill as it is introduced, the bill is seeking to essentially make it illegal for the federal government and federal employees to discuss racism in the workplace. And so the irony is we're having a conversation here in the committee room that would probably be prohibited by the bill itself. That's what the bill is trying to stop, is having these kinds of conversations.
Will the
So
gentlelady
I just
yield?
want to point that out, and I yield back.
Will the gentlelady yield? I think I have time, actually. Chairman, do I have time?
Yes. I recognize Mr. Cloud.
That's a misstatement, while maybe well-intended. What this does say is that if you're a federal contractor, you cannot force your employees to attend DEI training. You can't make them sign a paper that says that they recognize that they are from a privileged race, or all these things are happening. It does not prohibit a discussion about people. The freedom of speech will still exist at companies all over the place, will still exist at contractors, at any organization getting a grant. So I think you're overstating what this bill does in that regard.
Okay, gentlemen, would you allow me a moment, yield me a moment for me to read the language of the bill?
Sure.
Okay. Multiple places in the bill specifically makes it illegal for the federal government to enter into agreements, to provide grant funding, to otherwise engage with public, private, or nonprofit entities that do the following, and this is the exact language. Maintain an office relating to diversity, equity, or inclusion, maintaining or employing a chief diversity officer or substantially similar officer, developing, implementing, distributing, publishing, or purchasing a training course relating to diversity, equity, inclusion, or accessibility, which is folks with disabilities, critical theory relating to race or gender. You're not even allowed to talk about intersectionality, folks, sexual orientation or gender identity.
I'll take back my time.
But that's what the bill actually says, you guys.
The
It
key
says it
provision was the
multiple
first
places.
part. The key provision was the first part. No taxpayer funds will go to. It does not prohibit those things from happening. If you own a business and you want to have a DEI office, you can have a DEI office. But we're not going to make the American taxpayer pay for it. That's simply what it says. Not funding something is not prohibiting something.
All right. Now we're ready to vote. Good deal. The question is on the amendment number 2 offered by Ms. Pressley. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No.
Request a recorded vote.
In the opinion of the chair, a recorded vote has been requested by Ms. Pressley. As previously announced, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. For what purpose does Ms. Presley seek recognition? You seek more recognition? Oh, we're done. Good deal.